Hello and welcome to the conversation room. Today we talk about not enough, why representation in media and translation matters. My name is Ellen Wagner. I am the founder and the CEO of Cross Cultural Bridges. Cross Cultural Bridges is located in Princeton, the United States at the East Coast. And as you might see, it is super sunny today. It is super warm here in my office. And if you like, you can use the chat as well and type in from where you are tuning in. We're curious from where you're tuning in right now. So please use the chat and share your location. That would be awesome. So, what am I doing with Cross Cultural Bridges? Cross Cultural Bridges is supporting organizations not only in Germany, but also the United States in getting a more inclusive corporate culture and to discriminate less, to unbias the organization and to really use and learn the tools, be aware of different forms of oppression. And my main focus, or our main focus, is anti-Black racism. And as you all know, it is Black History Month, yes, in the United States for the whole of February. And therefore, we are featuring the conversation room this month with awesome people of color and Black people experts who share their perspective. And today, I'm not alone. I have two awesome people here in the room. And I see Catherine, hey, is tuning in from Magdeburg. It's so great that you're here. Amsterdam, yay, the Netherlands. So we have an international crowd today. That's awesome. So here I have Karen, and Karen is a translator for German and English. Karen will introduce herself in just a second. And we also have Chiponda here. Chiponda is a expert for diversity and a journalist, and you will get to know them in just a bit. So today we have roughly about 60 minutes, and because this panel is not only for us, but I also love it because I learned so much, but it's also for you out there. So please use the chat anytime to give us your feedback. Please share if you agree or if you do not agree with what we say. So the more input we get from you, the more interactive this is going to be. If you have any question, please use the chat and type in your questions. If we don't answer the question during the panel, there might be also time at the end for a little Q&A, really depending on the flow today of this session. So everybody out there tuning in from Facebook, from YouTube, from LinkedIn, please use the chat and yeah, communicate with us. All right. Okay then. So we'd like to get to know the panelists here a little more. So Karen, let's start with you. Would you like to tell a little bit about yourself, from where you are tuning in and what you do?
Okay, I'm tuning in from Düsseldorf. First of all, thank you that I'm allowed to take part in this panel. And yeah, like Ellen said, I'm a translator in the language for English German. That kind of happened because I lived in the UK for 6 years, and I realized that I'm good at languages and I enjoy speaking languages every day, and wanted to use my skills in that way. And recently I realized that, kind of by accident, but I think also intentionally, I've been focusing my translations more in the diversity and inclusion area. And I've been translating, for example, for the Historical Museum of Frankfurt, where they did an exhibition on the topics of racism and inclusion. And they've kind of continued to do other exhibitions in that area where I've also translated for them. And other things I've done in the past few years, I'm just going to present myself. Basically, I started the collective Schwarzes Haus in Düsseldorf, which is a collective focused on basically bringing more Black people to the cultural landscape in Germany. And in 2020, I started a ballroom voguing collective called Shapes and Shades, also with other people that was focused on also again in Düsseldorf increasing the ballroom scene here, because when it comes to voguing and ballroom, that kind of in terms of Germany, it started in Düsseldorf, but it's kind of migrated a lot to Berlin. And that collective's aim was to kind of bring it back to Düsseldorf and cultivate the scene again. And that's some of the things I've been doing in the past few years. And I started a fashion brand in 2018. So yes, I'm
So
gonna.
many exciting things.
I know.
Thank you so much, Karen. Before we keep introducing Chiponda, or you introduce yourself, Karen, one question. Ballroom. I heard about that, but can you just tell us a little bit about what that is for everybody who
Oh,
doesn't know?
how can I say in a short amount of time? So ballroom started in the 60s and 70s in New York. It was started by Black and Latinx queer people who decided that they were being ostracized in other spaces and wanted to create their own space. And ballroom kind of started with drag queens and also with posing, which is how voguing started. It started out as posing because people saw the mannequins or models in fashion magazines and wanted to imitate it. And that's how voguing kind of started. And it's been going for a very long time. And I think in Germany it started around 2012 when the scene kind of came over from the US to over here. And what else can I say about it? Yeah, the scene is really lively. Like if you know where to look, there's a lot of things happening in Germany. And I think in Cologne there's another ball happening in March. Right.
Awesome. Yeah, I think I'm very close to the voguing or the ballroom scene here in New Jersey and New
Nice.
York. But yeah, as a parent, and I'm going to sleep at 9 in the evening, I haven't managed to get there, but maybe one day I will.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for introducing yourself, Karen. That's wonderful. Chiponda, would you like to tell a little bit more about yourself?
Yes, I can just try to, yeah, I'll try. And I don't have too many exciting things as vlogging. I wish I have that in my portfolio, but I could talk to Karen after this and try and see if we can think about doing that because I'm in Berlin. So obviously there's a vlogging scene here, like she said. I'm a journalist, mostly with Deutsche Welle, which is Germany's international broadcaster. And I'm also a member of the editorial board there. And my work in the editorial board is really looking at how inclusive and diverse our content is and can be, where we need to improve what we're doing right. So there's a lot of discussions I have with other journalists, editors, producers about what we could do better and what we're doing well. So it's a big mix, obviously. And there's of course a lot of movement even within media regarding diversity and inclusion. In terms of my other work, I also worked with Neue Deutschen MedienmacherInnen. So for those who are in Germany, you would know what that means. So it basically means new German media makers, if I translate it literally. And I'm a member of that organization. It's mostly journalists of color, Black journalists, but also queer journalists. And we also have, of course, white journalists who are allies as well. So a mix. And because, of course, we're talking about journalists of a so-called migration background or migration history here in Germany. So they're also members in the organizations. They'll be maybe from Eastern Europe or other parts of the world as well, of course. And we did a study last year on the representation of people with a migration background in the evening news. So we focused on three broadcasters in terms of primetime news, and we looked at that, and that was interesting to look at the findings of that. So that's something you could also look at, and I'll see if we can get a link to the study posted. If not now, then you can also reach out on LinkedIn, and I'll try and make sure I share that with you. So that's just something we could also talk about later on. But yeah, that's a bit about me, and I mostly write um, in business journalism. So that's what I do. I also produce the business news at Deutsche Welle sometimes. It's on TV, and that's sort of mostly behind the scenes. But every now and then, I'm also in front of the camera.
Yes, sometimes we see you in front of the camera and you're looking good. Thank you so much for introducing yourself, Chiponda. So today's title is representation, right? And I feel already this room is representation. Yeah, it's good to see a room full of color of people who make history. And yeah, the question is, maybe there are some people out there who don't really know what diversity and inclusion is. I mean, could be. It's still buzzwords. And what does it mean for yourself? And why is it important that we think about that? Chiponda, would you like to go first?
Well, diversity and inclusion, like you said, it sort of feels like it's a buzzword right now, but I think it's also a question of representation and who people identify with, who the different groups are within society, and that's always changing as well. So it's not always the same. It's a question of also looking, of course, at structures and privilege, and also people who have more privileges than others. Of course, it's also contextual because, of course, it's a question of intersectionality. So how, someone being, queer and black, how that might, play out for them. It won't be the same as for someone who might be a cis, straight, black person, for instance. And so there's all these different elements that we try to understand. And of course, the conversation, say 30 years ago, wasn't so much about, intersectionality or queer people as much as it is today. So of course, the conversation around diversity and inclusion is also changing as we become more aware of the various experiences. Because a lot of people were having those experiences of exclusion at that point, but they never had words for it, and we're still finding words. And I think that's sort of where the discussion is, and it's sort of playing out within society, but at the same time also playing into the different areas we sort of inhabit, whether it's at work or at home, even in relationships. I think there's different ways we can experience diversity and inclusion, because of course these experiences, they sort of they feed into everything we experience, and even if we don't have the words for it. So I think it's important to just have these discussions, because of course the more we share, the more we understand what really is diversity and inclusion for the society we live in today.
You're muted.
Well, that's a classic. Thank you so much. I was waiting for this moment. Talking about relationship, my wifey is just tuning in, so I'm waving to her right now. Shouldn't you be working at this point? But I'm glad you're joining this panel. And yeah, I have a white wife, and diversity and inclusion is a huge topic also in our relationship, not only in my job. And last time I had the feedback on the first panel that there were so many terms that we dropped. So I just want to explain two of the terms, and the other terms you can Google. Google is there and it's free. So don't worry. And you can also DM us after the panel. But two terms that I want to explain is privilege. What is privilege? Oftentimes you hear something like there's white privilege, people have privilege. And for me, privilege is the absence of hurdles and barriers in your life. So the more privilege you have, the more you conform to the norm, or the more you look like the norm, you talk like the norm, and where in the context that you're moving, the less barriers you have. The moment that you're different from the norm, the less privileges you have, and the more you have to fight to be seen, to be heard, to get the resources that you need. And the other term was cis. So cisgender people, I'm a cis woman. So when I was born, I was assigned with one of the two dominant genders, male or female. So I identify as a woman, and I'm a cisgender woman. If people are not cis, they might be trans, meaning that they get assigned a gender that they are not. Okay, so Karen, I want to hear a little bit about you. What does diversity and inclusion mean to you, and why is it so important to think about that, especially in your field?
For me, it's just an element of fairness, because the world looks the way it looks. So why does the TV or literature, whatever, why does it have such a limited range? Or why aren't we seeing the people that are writing outside of that range? Why aren't they getting the spotlight? And in terms of translation, I think you can tell, for example, I keep going back to films and Netflix for some reason right now, and even before we had this event, and I was thinking about this event on what to say. Like, for example, with translations on subtitles, sometimes it's like, oh, this was not the best translation, or did someone who's actually from that cultural group or that marginalized group actually write these subtitles? And it can be painful, because it can be a film like that's really inclusive, where the author or the scriptwriter and producers actually did a good job, and then it all gets lost in translation, literally, because the script hasn't been translated in a way that is sensitive to different cultures, for example. So that's why diversity inclusion is important to me. It's just that that diversity literally gets translated so other people can also experience that diversity and inclusion, actually feel included, even if it's not necessarily in their original language.
Yeah, thank you, Karen. And you have been talking already about representation in media, translation, film. So that brings me to the next question. If you think about representation in movies or media in general, can you think of good examples and not so good ones? And Karen, let's start with you.
It's so funny because like there's so many films and so many TV shows, and when I'm thinking about films, and the thing is, like, I'm not a person who's like, for a film to be diverse, there have to be 2 Black people, 2 white people, 2 Asian people. No, to me, like, diversity means like as a whole picture, the whole market should be more diverse. And I think a good example of like of diversity, for example, for me in terms of film in the recent years was Black Panther, because the film was produced, well, okay, it was produced by Disney, which isn't a Black company, but you could tell that there was cultural sensitivity going on, that there were Black people involved from different continents. And I think that was the reason why so many people went to see it, especially Black people, because it didn't feel like we're going to see another film about Black suffering, because that to me is not a good example of diversity, seeing a Black film about Black people and their suffering, if that makes sense. Yeah. So that was a good example for me.
Yeah, definitely. Talking about racial trauma, right? There are so many movies where Black people have to suffer and racism gets reproduced. And Chiponda, do you have any good examples or not as good examples for representation in media?
Well, I'm trying to think in terms of representation in media, because of course, I mean, there are formats which are doing a better job, and whether it's always equitable is of course the question, because of course it also has to be the whole chain. And so it's like Karen mentioned there, it's also um, the people involved in the making, and the market it's for, and then of course the product itself. And I think in media, when I think of it, it's always hard, because one of the problems we have in especially Western media is that Western media tends to be, in general, it doesn't do a very good job of being inclusive and diverse and equitable at the same time. And I think we're having the conversation now, but I think we are not there yet, because obviously, when you talk about cinema, you have a production, and sometimes, of course, you might have the company that might be funding it, or you can even go and fund it differently without having a major um, production, media production house behind it. I mean, of course, those are the Netflix example. Unfortunately, I will also go back to that one, because at least interestingly, I heard about Tales of the City and how it was produced. And that was really super interesting, because of course, they also involved, trans writers and trans, producer, and of course, the person who wrote Tales of the City is a gay man, and then of course the actors and everything. So it was the whole value chain, and that's what we should be talking about. So if we want to talk about diversity and inclusion in media and good examples, and I would be wanting to go behind the scenes and seeing that as well, behind the scenes, that the people who are represented are also the people who are potentially maybe contributing to the work that's the work that's being created. And that's, I think, that seems to be a sort of mismatch sometimes, and that's not always bad, but I think it's kind of obvious that some people are just not in the media at all, so they're not doing any work, and if they are, they're like 1% and maybe 12% of the population, and then we definitely have a problem there. So I think there are not too many good examples. I think probably there's a few shows here and there that one could think of, which I could also name, but I don't want to just do PR for specific shows. I think so it has to be bigger mainstream examples that we should be looking at.
Yeah, definitely. And for everybody out there who's tuning in, and I see already comments coming in the chat, please share your favorite example of movies where you think representation is really good, so the others can also learn and we can share our knowledge here. Yeah. Chiponda, you have been talking about designing media in an inclusive way for people out there who are working in the media field, and I think the field is huge. But what are things that people can do in a very concrete way to design media more inclusive?
Well, I think something that needs to be done in the media to make it more inclusive in terms of the way it's designed is really talk about who our audiences are and communicate that transparently, and also talk about who works for us and communicate that. And then we can talk about whether we need to be, thinking about changing who's working for us gradually to match a little bit, that there's more of a match between who we see and who we're trying to reach, and who's making it. Because I think some of the inequities or the focus, like Karen mentioned, the stories about Black people in Hollywood, for instance. But it's just not Hollywood, because even on the media, if you try watching any major Western broadcaster, the stories about Africa or even just Black people in the US specifically are generally not as positive as they could be, or they just don't tell the whole story. And I think there's a tendency to focus more on the negative for certain groups of people, and that's pretty obvious. So I think that needs to shift, but it's really hard to make that shift or to pivot um, without having some sort of weird inspiration porn thing going on if you don't have the right people to identify the stories. And of course, it's really hard if you only have one Black journalist or whoever is missing in your newsroom, to say here's a story, because that person will always need to convince everyone that that's actually a story. And it's always hard to have to explain yourself over and over again. So I think we need to talk about audiences. So who are we trying to reach, and what can we do in terms of making sure that we have the kind of representation that enables us to reach the audience we're trying to reach. But of course, we need to go beyond that, because journalism is supposed to be objective. But we cannot be objective when we only include views from one side. And so that's also important to think of it in terms of objectivity. And of course, we talk about objectivity for some groups of people, and other groups of people, we say, oh, he's Black, maybe he shouldn't be reporting on the Black community, or they're Muslim or whatever. So I think that needs to shift as well.
Mhm. Chiponda, one more question. If you would have a media company and you have all the freedom and financial resources, what would you do?
Well, I mean, I think what's really important is really dialogue. And I mean, we talked about even, how diversity and inclusion and how the conversation around it has really shifted in the last couple of years. It's gained a lot of momentum, I think, in recent years. And I think the more we talk to each other, like even with people who have extremely different views, the better it would be. So I think I would want to have a very diverse and inclusive workforce, where we create formats that are really about dialogue and talking, and more long formats, because I think a lot of the news reports we see today, they tend to be very snappy and short. But I think people need time to digest, information, and people want to have long formats as well, where they can actually listen to someone speaking and maybe even experience a change in terms of the way they are framing something, or they say that, oh, I'm going to go home and think about that. I don't agree with you, but I'm going to go home and think about that, and something like that. We need more of those formats. I think there's not enough of that, because of course we're so focused on clicks and views, and and trying to compete at the same time with TikTok or Instagram Reels, whereas we should be trying to really perhaps create more dialogue in society and try to bring different sides together, because of course that's actually our job as journalists.
Yes. Thank you, Chiponda. Karen, let's talk about you. One way to be represented is to be out there, right? To do it ourselves. This is what we do here in the conversation room. I just did it, right? I think some panels out there are very homogeneous, very white, very heteronormative, and so forth. So I created this room, and I invite the people that are out there, of course, but not actually represented in the form that they should be. So you became a translator. You are changing history. Can you tell us how you, yes, how you became a translator?
I think I've always liked languages, and it was a happy accident, kind of, because I started a student job back at university where I was translating article descriptions for like this e-commerce website. And then I was like, okay, this is a good thing to do. Let me continue this after university. And then I got my accreditation with the IHK, the Commerce Chamber here in Germany. And then I took the next step and became accredited, so I could do official translations for courts and documents, passports, driving licenses, that kind of thing. So it just it's it happened intentionally, but at the same time unintentionally, because I was like, okay, I'll keep doing this. Let me get my certificates, and slowly the clients started running, not running, but the clients started contacted me, and that's how I became a translator and decided to do it freelance. And also because I wanted to work for myself, and I realized that it's a good path for me to work for myself, to use translation to do that. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So some people out there might use DeepL or Google Translate. Why do we need humans in translation? That might be a stupid question, but I'm asking it anyway.
It's a very important question, because if you're in the translation Facebook groups, it's like a question that comes up every single day. It's like, oh no, this person's contacted me to do some editing on a translation, but I know they use DeepL. And the thing is, like, especially in the area of like diversity and inclusion, as long as racist people make racist algorithms, like, you'll need humans to correct them. That's, to me, is the simplest answer. Like, because especially if you consider like also like literature translations, you need kind of like the emotional feel of a human to kind of make the translation flow. And I know the machines are going to get better and better at some point, but currently, as it still stands, because we know how algorithms work, and we know that they're not this random robot thing. We know it's made by a human, and as long as humans have biases, you need another human who has who can see those biases and correct them. We will need humans in translation. Yeah.
Yeah. There was one discussion about Amanda Gorman's book, I think in Germany, and they were discussing, or I think on TV even, why it's not a good idea that a white person would translate that. Who would like to talk about that and share your perspective on that? Chiponda,
I'll
Karen?
be very honest, I missed that complete debate. So Chiponda, please.
I didn't miss it. I think I was here in Germany. What is my view on that? I think it's all about the value chain that I spoke of. I think if you have like a Black artist create something, and then, like I mentioned, the value chain. So if everyone behind them, or everyone who's involved, everyone else is not from the community that they come from, if they talk about that and they're making, and it's a commercial thing, then I find it problematic that it only involves them white people or non-Black people in that case. I think it would be nice to involve other, and not just Black people, but also perhaps people from other communities that may have or share similar experiences of exclusion. So I don't think it's to say that there should be no white people or no non-Black people involved. It's to say it's the value chain should be equitable, because we know that these groups of people don't get the same amount of access to these opportunities. I think publishing is one of the most elite professions, especially in terms of when it comes to literature or a certain type of literature, then it's definitely very elite in terms of who gets to work there. Agents, it's really hard to get an agent who's not white in some countries. If you want to be successful, at least maybe you could get one, but maybe not at the level that would allow you to get a mainstream bestseller or something. And I think that's something that needs to be discussed, because of course it's all about making sure that the value chain is an equitable place that allows for different people to have access to it, and it's good for everyone else because everybody gets access to those things. Because of course, by making a place exclusive, that means that the types of works that we get are probably maybe not as good as they could be. I mean, we think they're good, but they could be much better than they are, and that's the point. And I think we need to do a better job. And of course, then it also creates a problem in terms of narratives within society, which is something that is also about inclusion and diversity, which is where the media also plays a role. What narratives make it into the news, and what does that mean for how people understand politics, for instance. And then of course you get a problem sometimes, a disconnect between how the media covers things and how people vote, and that maybe is a signal to the media that maybe they're not doing a good job of being balanced, or showing certain views in their shows or whatever. And that's extremely important to have discussions. Is this also about diversity and inclusion, and how do we become more diverse and inclusive in order to make sure that the views that are not making it into our reports or our reporting and coverage make it there as well. So that's the whole point. But I hope I didn't digress back into the media.
No, it's fine, Chiponda. It's really fine. It's good to hear your perspective. And I was talking with Karen in the past about the way we work. You were talking about views and perspectives. So the places that I've been working for were very white. I'm a queer woman. They were very heteronormative. And that has an impact, of course, on acceptance, tolerance, and all these things. And I was talking with Karen about how we deconstruct the affirmations and the things that we've learned from the corporate world out there, from people who might see the world differently. Karen, how do you deconstruct your work? What is it, and how do you create your own?
It's such a big question, because I feel like it's a continuous process. Because I still do things like getting up early in the morning. That just works for me. But what else did I do different? Like, I feel like when I was working at my old place, when I was still employed, the things I could do, like the range of things I was allowed to do, or the suggestions I could do, was limited. Like, you might say, oh, I think it would be a good idea if we did X, Y, Z, and it would be like, maybe later, maybe later. And the good thing is, because I work for myself, I can just do that. And I had to do things like, and we spoke about this, like, for example, when someone emails you and they're like, this has to be done in the next 10 minutes. And I had to realize for myself, that's your emergency. It's not my emergency. Why are you coming to me at the very last minute? And because sometimes when people come to me with stress, I take that stress on myself, and I had to learn to be like, this is not a me problem. And I also want to be like that towards other people, that I don't stress them. So I think, especially with COVID and having more time to think about how we want to work, I want to work towards a work week where I only have to work like 4 hours a day. That's not possible right now. That's why I'm
We'll get
working
there.
towards. That's the goal. And yeah, like, I think I had to redefine for myself the kind of goals I want to reach, what I want to happen in my life, that kind of thing. So yeah, I always have to question, like, am I doing this because I want to, or is it because society says this is what work should look like? Yeah.
Yeah, nice. There's a question about privilege. We've been talking about privilege earlier on, and Marcelo, thank you for your question. Ask, almost bad, or would it be okay if you have privileges and use it for helping people without? That's probably almost a rhetoric question, but who would like to answer that?
Okay, I'll go ahead. I think in terms of using privilege for helping people without it, I think it's always important to ask yourself why you're doing something. Like Karen pointed out, she's speaking of herself in this regard. But I think even when you are, using your privilege, I think if you're using it in order to look better, to promote your own career and not create space for others, then I don't think you're really doing a good job. So I think there's like these types of allies who like, or this, diversity and inclusion being a trendy topic these days. It's kind of hard to figure out sometimes who's really being authentic in their intentions to do something. And then of course, it's not just about the intention, it's also about really creating space for those people who don't have a space, and making it possible for them to be included. So I think if you use your privilege to say, I'm stepping aside not to do this project because I think there's someone within the company who otherwise wouldn't get this opportunity, and I think they should get the chance, and you speak up for them, then that's slightly different than, saying, okay, I think we should be doing more for these people or these people, and just putting yourself there as the person speaking for that group of people. Then it becomes a little bit harder, I'd say. So I think it's about creating space. If you are creating space, then you're doing a good job with your privilege.
Thank you. Karen, would you like to add anything on that?
Yeah, my answer to that question is, like, if you have the privilege to help people, you have to help. Like, to me, there's no option on this. And like Chiponda said, like, it shouldn't be performative. It shouldn't be a thing of, look at me, I'm helping people. But it should be like, the interest should be to actually help these people and use your privilege to help them move forward. Yeah.
Yes, sweet and short. Thank you, Karen. Chiponda, there is a lot of fear about diversity. There are a lot of questions, a lot of question marks. Privilege, that's such a huge topic, and people feel ashamed sometimes if they have privilege, which I think they shouldn't really. They should just use it. But what can be done to make it maybe more fun, more interesting for people to get involved? And not only people in media, but everyone.
Well, I mean, I think it's fair to say that we all have some sort of privilege, of course, and I think, just the fact that we are here means that we obviously have a certain amount of privilege. Of course, privilege is also contextual, so it changes depending on which space you're in. So being highly aware is what we need to do, and I think we just need to talk, and I think we need to be ready to correct each other and have discussions and be honest, and to laugh and cry about it together would be more I don't want to say fun, but more interesting for everyone, and just I think it would be a great process that would allow us and enable us to see that actually the things we fear are the same things that everybody fears. People who haven't been allowed into those spaces, they've had to live with the fear of losing out all the time. Whereas if you're fearing losing out today because you think, oh, I'm not the group of people who are considered disadvantaged, so I'm going to lose out on opportunities. That fear that you have now, think of now having that fear for maybe most of your life, because maybe you come from a group that tends to be excluded from those spaces, or you just don't even see yourself represented in those spaces. And that, of course, then is a sort of a daily experience. So I think trying to see that actually we can be empathetic, because these are feelings that we all have, but we can only solve this problem if we work together. And I think if we start looking at what's behind what we feel, then we might do a better job of fixing it, perhaps.
Yes, working together. I totally agree. Karen, would you like to add anything to that? How we can maybe make this topic more appealing for people with privilege?
I think it's just, for me, a thing of, like, let's sit at the table together and let's see how we can kind of progress. I think a lot of the fear that I notice in my social media bubble is the fear of, oh, what if I use the wrong term, say the wrong thing, that kind of thing. But I think it's important to kind of put that fear to the side and speak more about, okay, not what can I do wrong, but more what can I do right. Yeah.
Yes, thank you. One other question for everybody who's watching right now and who's thinking, okay, translation, that might be something because I was raised bilingual, because I'm very good at languages. How can people start to enter this field, translation, and Chiponda, of course, media, if people are out there and there might be a global minority, Black people, people who do not who are not in the heteronormative norm. How can you enter these spaces? Karen, would you like to start?
Yeah, so I can only encourage more people to become translators, because I don't know a lot of Black translators and I need there to be more. But I didn't study translation. Like, you can study translation, but you don't have to study translation to become a translator. I was lucky because I grew up bilingual and grew up in a different country as well. and that was also a good prerequisite to have. But basically, one thing you can do, so you basically have more credentials, is get accredited through the IHK, the German Commerce Chamber of Commerce. But especially if you speak a more rare language, you can basically just start translation from day one. Obviously, practice, and maybe have someone who can look over your work. But it's actually easier done. No, not easier said than done. It's easier to do than most people think. Like, there's not a huge barrier to entry, which some people might criticize because it might reduce the quality sometimes. But what I like about the field is that it's accessible, and it's a good field for people of color, especially to enter, because people of color, especially if they're raised not in their parents' country, will often be raised bilingual, and it's a good way to use your skills, I think. I hope I explained it in a way that was easy to understand.
Totally, completely, Karen. Yes.
Okay.
And Chiponda, any tips from your side?
Well, I think the barrier to entry has really been reduced in the last couple of years when it comes to media, because of course it's super easy to you know, make videos with your own smartphone, or record audio and have a podcast potentially. And so I think the barriers to entry are much lower. So I think for a lot of people who are from excluded groups, I would say start where you are. I mean, network, try to meet journalists or people who are working in the media already. And well, not just, well, me of course, but I'll promote myself, but of course with other people as well. Curate, of course, topical as well, like what kinds of topics you want to work in, and follow those people and then talk to them. But start where you are and start doing stuff, because sometimes if you try to wait along for the right employer to find you, that could be harder, and it's easier for them to find you when you already have stuff. So I think that's important to consider. And in terms of innovation, I think a lot of innovation is happening outside of the mainstream media houses, and they kind of get on the bandwagon a little bit later. So I think if you want to be innovative, it's nice when you are on your own and you're trying out things, and you're not like stuck in certain processes and structures, which sometimes make it harder to innovate, to be honest. And I think that's important. So just start where you are and don't wait, and just network. Start where you are. Ask, reach out to people on social media. They will answer. Maybe not all of them, but at least some of them will. So that helps.
Exactly. And when I founded my own company, I was doing tons of virtual coffees. This is also how we met, Chiponda, right? I asked you, hey, can we have a chat? And I tried to have virtual coffees with everyone out there who sounds interesting, who might be different from me and have different perspectives, so I can learn. So this is essential. And this network I have been growing over the past years. This is kind of my home. If I need anything, I ask, I reach out, and the community is always there. Which means, of course, that you should give the community something, right? You cannot just enter your network saying, hey, I need help, someone, and never give back. I think it's really a giving and a taking. And also have the understanding that sometimes people don't have the energy to give. Sometimes people even don't have the energy to ask. So everybody out there who's privileged, and you see people, you observe people, and you think they might have a dream, maybe you can ask them if they might be interested in getting a promotion. Sometimes people are very shy. Sometimes people have certain images in their head and think, no, I cannot do that. And that is something, if you have privileges, if you have the language, the education, if you have the social status, and so forth, use this privilege and invite others, right? Invite them, make them visible, represent them. And if you see a panel the next time and you say, hey, there are only white people on the panel and there are like loads of people, there might be space for some people with an Asian background or a Black background or whatever it is. So let's think about diversity a little more and try to promote others who have, as we now know, have more barriers and do not have as many privileges. So everybody out there, we are almost getting to the end of this panel discussion. So if you have questions, now is the time to type them in the chat. I have one more question. So if you would love to see more in media or the world, what would it be? What is your demand? What do you ask from the universe out there? Huge question, I know. But if you can make a wish, what would it be? Who would like to go first?
I want to see more from like the African continent, and I know there's like a lot happening already that I don't see because I'll be honest, I'm mostly on Netflix, and I know there's other streaming platforms as well. But when I think about that, a few years ago, I saw it was like this group of boys, I think from Nigeria, who only used their mobile phones to create like films, and I thought that was really fascinating. How even when your resources are limited, people can find a way to make something big. And I want to see more from that side. Like I feel like we've seen, especially when you consider the kind of Black perspectives we're getting in terms of media. I'd love to see more outside of America, maybe even outside of Europe, and see more from other countries, because like one thing I always notice is that Black people are literally everywhere. And it's always nice to see, and I'd love to see more of them when it comes to TVs and films. And I'd also like to see more Black German representation, because that's kind of lacking. There's people, I'm not saying there isn't, but there could be more. Because like when I lived in the UK, people were surprised that I was Black and German, because they were like, "Oh, aren't Germans really racist?" And I was like, "Yes, but Black people still live there." Like, yeah.
Yes, and there cannot be enough of us. Chiponda, what
Yeah,
would you
picking
like
up
to see
on
more?
I think I'll just pick up. I'll piggyback on what Karen said. When I was in the UK once, I was in a store, and the black person who was, trying to, make sure I could pay at the store. I won't say which company it was, but it's a big one, a big American company. And then he was like, "What? You live in Germany and you're black? Aren't they racist?" And I mean, I think it just does play into the images also of the countries, and I think there's a lot of issues in terms of narratives and in terms of even global narratives we have today about the way the world works. And it's so important to get different voices and different perspectives in there. And that could be in film and in literature when it comes to maybe, even translation or art, creative ventures. But it goes beyond that. It goes also in the media and in politics. So in every area we can talk about, I think it's really about having as many different points of view as you can. And I think if you have a fairly significant, say, Black population or minority population, which is not seen on TV or in certain areas and spaces, then everyone should be asking why that is. And of course, those people go elsewhere because there's so many choices anyway today, which is one of the challenges the media faces. Um, but I think we shouldn't wait for those people to turn away. We should be trying to, solve the problem before it becomes a real problem.
Yes, and one step to do that is to listen to the conversation room. That was panel number 2 of 5 from the time here in Black History Month. So I would love you to tune in again already next Friday. And now we're already at the end of today's panel. Thank you so much, Karen, for being here. Thank you so
Thank
much,
you.
Chiponda, for sharing your perspective and giving us an insight of your job and what diversity and inclusion got to do with that. So thank you for everyone out there for stating your questions and interacting with us in the chat, sending us hearts and claps. And yeah, this is it. I want to thank my team who is also here in the background. Hewan, you did an amazing job. Thank you so much, everyone out there, and hope to see you soon again. Bye.